Thank you for coming out on this kind of rainy, apparently, night. So excellent. My name is Liz Williams, and I'm the director of Gadsby's Tavern Museum, part of the Office of Historic Alexandria. As we move into this new era in programming, yay technology, I'm excited that we can host our first official hybrid event here at the Lyceum. So I want to wave howdy to all of our friends at home on Zoom and howdy to everyone here in the room. It's also nice to see people actually in person, IRL. And many of you are familiar faces because many of you are members of the Gadsby's Tavern Museum Society. So if you are interested in joining our friends group, I'm going to give a shout out to Sue. She's going to do the royal wave in the room. If you're interested in joining, she can certainly help you with any questions. A few housekeeping items before I introduce Dr. Henriques. For those of you here, our book signing will begin shortly after the lecture downstairs. For those at home, for the Q&A, please use the chat for your questions. Our staff will be monitoring Zoom and will make sure that it will get asked. And if you would like a signed copy of Dr. Henriques' book, we will have limited copies for sale here at the Lyceum. So definitely come out on not a rainy night. So with that, it is my honor to introduce Dr. Peter Henriques this evening. Dr. Henriques has been a frequent lecturer for us at Gadsby's, sharing his insight and latest scholarship on our nation's first president. Peter is the Associate Professor Emeritus of History at George Mason University and author of Realistic Visionary, A Portrait of George Washington. His most recent publication, First and Always, A New Portrait of George Washington, showcases many of his lecture topics presented at Gadsby's over the years, and to add to that, tonight's lecture. He was recently awarded a George Washington Fellowship by Mount Vernon, is a regular presenter at Colonial Williamsburg, and his current project, a new book, Fire and Ice, the relationship between George Washington and John Adams. So please welcome to the podium, Peter Henriques, for What Made George Washington Tick.
I'm flattered that anyone would be willing to come out on a night like this. So I do appreciate it. You know, we find ourselves in a strange setting as I look out. I think it might be of some comfort to know that George Washington, he would have worn a mask. Actually, during the American Revolution, Washington made one of his most important decisions is to vaccinate his army against the smallpox. It was a key decision that he did, and by the end of the war, many people have felt that without that we might not have been able to win. And it's interesting that we remember that type of thing, and he actually set the stage for or arguing that people should be vaccinated or pay fines way back in 18th century Virginia, believe it or not. Now, to start off, you know, most of you who have listened to me ever know that I kind of approach George Washington with three different perspectives or approaches. One, Washington really is the absolutely key figure in the founding of the American nation. There's no leader more important than he. There are two seminal moments in the creation of the United States of America. One, the winning of our independence, and two, the creation of nationhood. And they're not the same. But in both of those achievements, Washington is the central and crucial figure. I think you can actually summarize it with the phrase, no George Washington, no United States of America. It's that significant. Secondly, it's no secret that I have great admiration and respect for Washington. Full disclosure, as I mentioned in my book, I wear a medallion of him around my neck. But there's a third point that is as important as the other two, and that is, to the degree that's possible, I seek to understand the flesh and blood man, warts and all. I agree with David Stewart, who wrote a new book on Washington. Oh, I'm going faster than I should here. Let me see. Does it go back okay? A little hard for me to. Doesn't seem to work backwards. Well, we'll have to wait until I get up to the. Could you go back? Okay, that's fine. David Stewart wrote a book on the as a politician. I recommend it to you. It's an excellent book. And he made the comment showing him as a flesh and blood person, simultaneously self-effacing, insecure, wildly ambitious, deeply emotional, yet mostly buttoned up, was a tremendous challenge. And that's what I attempt to do in the final chapter of my book, which I entitle What Made George Washington Tick. But as the David Stewart quote illustrates, this is not an easy task. It's not easy because of all the founding fathers. Washington, more than any of the others, is hard to understand because he wants to be famous, but he does not want to be truly known. And that makes it a challenge. And there's no doubt there's some things we'll never know about George Washington. That's simply the case, any more than we'll really know exactly how the human brain works or how human consciousness works. But the fact that we can't understand totally how the mind works or consciousness works, it doesn't mean we can't learn more about it. We can and we will. And the same thing goes with George Washington. So recognizing the difficulty and not claiming any final truth, I want to share with you, after my many years of studying this remarkable man, and give you my sense of what makes him tick. And at the end, there's full chance for discussion, questions, disagreements, and so on and so forth. In the summer of 1783, as the peace talks in Paris between Great Britain and its former American colonies were grinding on, General George Washington wrote plaintively to his favorite brother, Jack, about how eager he was for the arrival of the definitive treaty, which he declared would put an end to his public life forever. The burden of public service would be over, and Washington could do what he really wanted to do, which is, I have no wish, which aspires beyond the humble and happy lot of living and dying a private citizen on my farm. Now, my argument is that despite such assertions, the historical evidence strongly suggests that George Washington was not a man to be satisfied with living and dying a private citizen on his farm, even on a state as beautiful as Mount Vernon. And that's what I try to develop in the last chapter. There, I use the insights of Carl Jung and his views on the shadow self. I think they're helpful, but I don't think they're necessary. And tonight, because there are some people who see any psychohistory, psychobabble, I don't want to read it, it's crazy. And I think I can make the point without that, and I'm going to experiment to do that tonight. As Liz kindly mentioned, my next project is between George Washington and John Adams. And I'm finding it easier to identify with Adams. He's short and bald, so I can have, and he's actually a hell of a lot of fun to read. Washington's diaries, if you don't have Ambien, you can try it. It probably puts you to sleep. But Adams is full of, I hate him, I love this guy, and so on and so forth. But in the course of my research on Adams, I stumbled upon some letters which I had not seen before I wrote my book, which confirmed my assessment of Washington. And frankly, I was encouraged that it came from a brilliant man, a perceptive observer who knew Washington well. And Adams made this assertion in a letter. Washington certainly did not know his own heart. He believed what he said of his aversion to public life and his attachment to retirement. And it's important to remember Washington at the conscious level absolutely believes this. But Adams says nothing could be farther from the true, real temper of his mind. He knew not himself. He could not be easy in retirement. And then he ended up concluding, Washington loved adulation and could not resist her charms. Edward Thornton, the preceptive secretary to the British ambassador, George Hammond, made a similar point. George Washington is a man of great but secret ambition, who loved to be treated with great respect. I think such insights are important and help us better understand the inner man. Specifically, if I were to have a thesis statement, if I were doing a paper, it would be that George Washington not only desired secular immortality, fame across the ages, but he also hungered for public acclaim while he could still revel in it. Now, that George Washington ardently sought fame across the ages is a commonplace claim, has been recognized by many Washington scholars. Washington's closest female friend, Eliza Powell, a fascinating woman worthy of study, she made an interesting comment in a letter to Washington, which speaks, I think, truth of that period, where she said, the love of honest fame has and ever will be predominant in the best, the noblest, and the most capable natures. I agree with that. The only thing I do is I really tend to make it the essential key to understanding Washington. I place a strong emphasis on the desire, what I call secular immortality, fame across the ages. Long ago in 1799, the Rosetta Stone was discovered. The Rosetta Stone makes Egyptian hieroglyphics for the first time comprehensible to modern readers, because on this stone, it was a decree on behalf of Ptolemy V. It was inscribed not only in the hieroglyphics, but also in Greek, actually, as well as Demotics. And now having the two put together finally allowed people to decipher what the hieroglyphics meant, which they simply could not do until the discovery of that factor. I think Washington's desire for secular fame can serve kind of as a Rosetta Stone for understanding core themes that drove him throughout his life. Like Adams, I believe he did not know his own heart. At a deep level, he craved the ego-based gratification of the notion that he was special and essential to the creation of the nation. Now, let me be clear. If George Washington walked in here, they'd say, no way. He would absolutely disagree with this assessment. He'd admit that he wanted the good opinion of honest men, friends to freedom, and well-wishers to mankind, as he put it. But he'd heatedly denied that he hungered after public adulation. Rather, Washington would be more likely to prefer a term that has been a favorite of his eulogist from 1799 when he died until today, the term selfless. I maintain that the frequent use of this altruistic term clouds our understanding of the flesh and blood George Washington. No doubt he sacrificed personal happiness on the altar of country. But at the same time, he was one of the least selfless men that ever lived. A selfless man does not end up owning over 50,000 acres of land, control over 300 slaves, and qualifying as one of the richest men in America. In fact, I think the very vehemence with which he denied his desire for public adoration raises flags. You know the quote from Hamilton, doth protest too much. And sometimes when someone is so eager to say no, you wonder why, and maybe there's something to it. Now, Washington, let me give you a few examples, because as any historian, you always want to present contrary evidence. Washington, here's one from his abandoned first. He didn't actually give this first inaugural address, but it says this: anyone who could imagine me capable of being so smitten with the allurements of sensual gratification, the frivolities of ceremony, the baubles of ambition, is as to be induced from such motives to accept the public appointment, I shall only lament his imperfect acquaintance with my heart. In another instance, he said, I consider it an indubitable mark of mean-spiritedness and pitiful vanity to court applause from the pen of or tongue of man. He wrote the British historian Catherine Macaulay Graham and said, all see and most admire the glare which hovers over the external trappings of elevated office. To me, there is nothing in it beyond the luster which may be reflected from its connection with the power of promoting human felicity. Wrote David Stewart, his good friend, pride and dignity of office has no charms for me. I can truly say I'd rather be at Mount Vernon with a friend or two about me than to be attended at the seat of government with all the hoopla that goes with it. Leaving Alexandria on the way home to Mount Vernon, he wrote James McHenry and made the comment, the attentions which we met with on our journey were very flattering, and to some whose minds are differently formed from mine would have been highly relished. But I avoided in every instance I had where I had previous knowledge of the intention of all parades and escorts. That's his repeated theme over and over again. It's public service, no interest in anything else. Maybe one of the best examples is as he's approaching New York City to be inaugurated the first president of the United States. He wrote his friend, Governor George Clinton, I can assure you with the utmost sincerity that no reception can be so congenial to my mind as a quiet entry devoid of ceremony. As you can imagine, can the hero of America be inaugurated president without no one noticing? As a typical drawing of the time came, it was greeted. Really, his road to New York was basically like the coronation of a king. Now, the examples demonstrate a key aspect of Washington's public persona, that he acts out of this sense of duty, characterized by disinterested service toward the greater good. However, I think, as I'll try to show you, an analysis of his actions considered over his lifetime demonstrates that he was not simply a selfless man or one who was engaged only in disinterested service. Rather, a pattern emerges of a man who was deeply ambitious, massively concerned with his reputation, and in regular search of approbation of an adoring public, even as he denied such desires. Where does this drive come from? It's hard to know. Washington is very much of an extrovert in most of his personality, outgoing, risk-taking, focused on approaching goals, emphasis on acquisition. When he was young, what he wanted to do was rise to the very top of Virginia society. That was his early goal. Virginia society, this is a picture of Bird, just giving you it's a different world, as you know from your study. 18th century Virginia is a patriarchal society. It's a hierarchical society. It's a deferential society. And it's completely dominated by the members of the gentry. And the gentry set themselves apart from ordinary people by the number of slaves they owned, their manner of their dress, their sumptuous lifestyle, their literacy, etc. Now, Washington faces difficulties in his goal to reach the top of that type of society. His family was only second-tier gentry, not top Virginia gentry. And his father's death when Washington was only 11 years old took the situation and made it much worse, especially because he had been married before and most good part of his assets went to his older first two sons, Lawrence and Augustine, leaving not so much for his second wife, Mary Ball, and 5 children, of which Washington was the oldest. It meant not only lack of money, I do have a chapter in my book that I entitled Complicated, Very Complicated, the relationship between Washington and his mother. It's, I think, a fascinating and an important part of his story. But Washington is going to be raised by a strong-willed, controlling, and emotionally demanding single mother, intent on having her firstborn and favorite child focus on meeting her needs rather than achieving his goals. Of course, some chips naturally fell Washington's way, or we wouldn't be here talking about him tonight. And probably the most important of all was the fact that his half-brother, Lawrence, who became the master of Mount Vernon, married into the very powerful family, the Fairfax family at Fort Belvoir. And going to Belvoir, that's really Washington's finishing school. That's where he learns, and Sally Fairfax helps him learn to become a complete Virginia gentleman. And William Fairfax, who's a member of unfortunately, there's no portrait of William Fairfax. I wish there were, but there isn't. He is probably he's certainly the most powerful man in Northern Virginia. And basically he becomes Washington's mentor and champion. That's a key event in his road to success. Now, given my thesis that Washington had conflicting feelings about his own drives, it's worth noting that his desire for worldly success conflicted with his upbringing, especially his mother's values. More steeped in faith than her son, the widowed Mary Ball Washington held such things as honor, fame, wealth. They paled as reward compared to eternal happiness. Stacked against God's glory, things like honors she saw as rust, quoting her favorite author, Matthew Hale. They were poor, empty, insipid things in the final accounting. But I think, despite such an upbringing, the evidence indicates that Washington cared more about the immortality of his legacy than he did about the immortality of his soul. While he invested little attention to his own heavenly personal life after death, he was deeply invested in ensuring that continuation of his earthly legacy. His belief, which I don't think ever changed, appeared in an early famous letter to Sally Fairfax. Most people don't focus on this quote in the letter, but he refers to the death of a young British officer, and Washington declared, "Who is there that does not rather envy than regret a death that gives life, gives birth to honor and glorious memory?" We're all going to die. The goal is honor and glorious memory. In a revealing letter to his friend and confidant, Marquis de Lafayette, the letters between Washington and Lafayette are particularly good because Washington is the more famous he gets, the more closed he is in his correspondence. But he trusts Lafayette so much because Lafayette loves him like a son would love his father, and he's sometimes more open and revealing in the letters to Lafayette. And I think he writes about how do you get glorious memory? And he wrote to Lafayette introducing the American poet, Joel Barlow. Mr. Barlow is considered by those who are good judges to be one of those bards who hold the key of the gate by which patriots, sages, and heroes are admitted to immortality. Such are your ancient bards, who are both the priests and doorkeepers of the Temple of Fame. And these, my dear Marquis, are no vulgar functions. Men of real talent in arms have commonly approved themselves as patrons of the liberal arts and friends to the poets. Why? In some instances, by acting reciprocally, heroes have made poets and poets have made heroes. That quote, I think, is particularly relevant, heroes making poets and poets making heroes, in looking at Washington's attitude towards a biography of himself while he was alive. Publicly, it was clear his attitude. As he put it, any memoirs of my life distinct and unconnected with the general history of the war, would rather hurt my feelings than tickle my pride while I lived. I'd rather glide gently down the stream of life, leaving it to posterity to think and say what they please of me, rather than by an act of mine have vanity or ostentation imputed to me. But take that letter and contrast it with his efforts to enlist his aide, David Humphreys, to write the general's biography, something I've not seen discussed in any other books so far. It may be, but I haven't seen them. David Humphreys, you will see this picture later when Washington gives up his command. The person next to Washington in the painting is Humphreys. Humphreys was an aide, a poet. On his tombstone, it says his name, beloved of George Washington. Beloved of Washington. Now, what does Washington do? He writes to Humphreys and says, come to Mount Vernon, make it your temporary home. You will be treated as one of the family, have complete access to Washington's papers, complete freedom to ask Washington on various issues. He explained why he wanted Humphreys. He said, I should be pleased that you undertake this business. Your abilities as a writer, your discernment respecting the principles which led the decision by arms, your personal knowledge of many facts as they occurred in the progress of the war, your disposition to justice, candor, and impartiality, and your diligence in investigating truth, combining fit you with the vigor of life for this task. But I submit the general certainly knew that Humphreys would not be impartial in the way we would use the term. In this case, I believe Washington hoped a poet would help make a hero. And Humphreys was a poet whose admiration and affection for the commander was, like Lafayette's, simply boundless. Consider this 1782 poem that he wrote about Washington. The foe then trembled at the well-known name, and raptured thousands to his standard came. His martial skill our rising armies formed, his patriotic zeal their generous bosom warmed, his voice inspired, his godlike presence led, the Britons saw, and from his presence fled. Well, Humphreys sees in Washington a godlike presence. I ask, who better to chronicle the life of someone who wants fame across the ages than someone who sees you as a godlike presence? And Humphreys does come to Mount Vernon and lives several years there, writes a partial draft, gives some of the material to Washington, who makes comments on it. It's as close as we have to an autobiography, although it's very brief. Washington, interestingly, ordered Humphrey to destroy the notes that he wrote, but Humphreys didn't, so we have them, and some of them are rather revealing. A typical example, Washington wrote, "Whether it be necessary to mention that my time and services were given to the public without compensation, that every direct or indirect attempt afterwards to reward them was refused, you can best judge whether to include." Do you think there's much doubt that he expects it to be included? Same thing when Phyllis Wheatley, the great Black poet, wrote a poem about him. He loved the poem, sent it to a friend. He said, really, it's wonderful, but I don't think it's published because it would be egotistical. But he sends it to a friend and the friend publishes it. So it's a little bit along that same line. Further evidence of Washington's desire for secular immortality appears in his extraordinary concern with preserving his papers, both private and public. From early on, the record of his existence seemed to fascinate Washington. And he's a real squirrel as far as keeping things. As Bill Abbott, my old professor when I was at the University of Virginia and an early editor of the papers, said that Washington reveals perhaps more clearly, if indirectly, the sense he came to have of the importance that his life held for history and for posterity in his attitude towards his papers, which he had gone to extraordinary lengths to gather together and to protect. He actually planned to build a special house at Mount Vernon for his papers, the first presidential library. Of course, he died before he could do that. Happily now, you can go to the library, the Fred W. Smith Library at Mount Vernon, and I'm planning to do that in connection with my new research project. And I've been there. It's a wonderful resource center where when Washington's papers are fully published, they're in the process by UVA and Mount Vernon, there will be 90 volumes of over 700 pages per volume. I mean, we're talking about, you've got a weekend to spend, it will keep you busy trying to go over that. I think another example that he courted recognition was his willingness to have creations of his own likeness. He moaned a little bit about it, but he'd sit for almost any painter who wanted to paint him. And indeed, when Houdon, the great sculptor, he was really the Michelangelo of the 18th century, Houdon came in. Why did Houdon come all the way from France and say no to doing the Countess of Russia's bust? Because, as Jefferson said, he pants for fame. And if he can do the best bust, and this is the best, absolutely most lifelike image of Washington, he came all the way from France, traveled with Washington for a week, studied him. When you the picture, one of the busts that I showed earlier, it's so much better. It catches the charisma of the man. And Washington goes through the discomfort of having a face mask, a life mask made, which is not pleasant, in order to get the likeness. When Lafayette came back to the United States in 1824 and visited Mount Vernon and saw the bust, which he said, burst into tears, that's the man himself. That's as close as we're going to come. Not the Gilbert Stewart painting at the end of his life that's on the dollar bill, but the Houdon bust catches the charisma of the man much better. A final example, more controversial and not as absolutely certain, though I think it's right, is that he kept it a secret. Washington apparently decided to locate his tomb in the heart of the United States Capitol building. He is a great nationalist. His emphasis, he's always an American firster. I saw great pictures of Robert E. Lee downstairs. Lee's a great man. He's a Virginia firster. Washington is an American first person, a great nationalist, sees the United States as a rising empire. And he recognizes we need a central capital, like the big capitals in Europe, to unify us. And it's interesting that following Pierre L'Enfant's removal as the architect of the Capitol, William Thornton took over the job to design a Capitol building. And although it's not in stone, it's almost certainly, after discussions with the president and approval by him, Thornton, who, by the way, called Washington his greatest friend on earth, drew up plans for a structure of a central rotunda. In that rotunda in the Capitol was to stand an equestrian statue of Washington. Underneath would be his remains as a unifying force for the country. After Washington's death, John Adams moved to make that be so in the form of a request. It's interesting to me. Now, some of you may say, wait a minute, didn't Washington say? Yes, he did. He said, it's my express desire that my corpse may be interred in a private manner without parade and funeral oration. A little bit like coming into New York to be inaugurated without any excitement. Can you imagine? Oh, Washington's dead. Next, what's for dessert? When Washington died, it's almost like everyone lost his father at the same time in America. You couldn't buy enough. Black ribbon was gone. People, in terms of the overall loss of time. But to me, the most interesting part of that, in view of this aspect, is that Martha Washington immediately agreed that the body be moved. And I just don't think that she would have done that unless there was a recognition that that's what her husband really wanted to do. Obviously, it doesn't take place, but it's significant that it was moving in that direction. Now, much evidence in the historical record demonstrates that Washington, in fact, strove to be special and worked to have others see him and his youth until his death along that line. He is special. He's very, very lucky physically. He takes enormous pride in his appearance. He does have, and this is crucial in the first chapter on what makes Washington a great leader in my book. The first thing I say, other than he's very lucky, because no one gets to the top without being very lucky, is his physicality. Washington is blessed with a remarkable physicality. And he worked hard. He has this natural athleticism that he worked hard to maintain and enhance. He took fencing lessons. He didn't expect to run anyone through, but for the grace of the movements. As you know, he became a marvelous dancer and the best horseman of his age. Those were skills that were highly admired and drew favorable notice from onlookers. And when you look at him going riding to the hounds, and it's a risky, exciting thing, and you read the clothes that he bought to wear, he's dressed to the nines for this occasion. And it brings us to attention to his apparel. In his world, appearance mattered, and he wanted both to fit in and to be noticed. And he developed and displayed a detailed personal style. I quote in my book, they found as a teenager, he's having a coat made and he's kept the record, and he's down, it's unbelievable, 4 inches down for this button, this hole, it just goes on how he wants it done. You just wouldn't expect, one, that he'd ever do that as a youngster, and two, that it was still preserved. He dresses strategically, almost theatrically, whatever the part. Junior officer on the make, fox hunting planter, senior military commander, president. And the attention he paid to his military uniforms is particularly pertinent as it pertains to his desire to be viewed as exceptional. There's an invoice on the eve of the French and Indian War that shows Washington spent 1/3 of his entire salary as the adjutant for the Southern District of Virginia on a new dress uniform from England. That quote, rich crimson coat, glorious with gold braid, 48 gold gilt buttons. Such regimentals would distinguish him from other military personnel who didn't have them. And the same invoice has him buy 2 handsome livery suits with his coat of arms for his servants to wear, making it clear that he expected to ride about in very high style. Most of you know he wore his uniform to the Second Continental Congress. It is not his old uniform from the French and Indian War. It's a new uniform that was made by the tailor, who, by the way, was Ona Judge's father. If you know a little bit about Ona Judge, and one of the most interesting of Washington's enslaved workers, that's no aberration. Immediately after he was appointed commander-in-chief, the record shows he spent 12 pounds on a Philadelphia tailor to make regimentals of better workmanship and trimmings than those were set by the less skilled tailor down at Mount Vernon, and soon ordered a blue ribbon or sash to, quote, distinguish myself. He didn't mothball his uniform after the war was over. When he decided to attend the Constitutional Convention in the spring of 1787, he brought his uniform with him, donning it once again to ride triumphantly into Philadelphia, escorted by the city's militia and the huzzas of the crowd. T.H. Breen declares, as an interesting book, The President's Journey, where Washington, to try to unify the country, traveled to every single state, because he was really the one thing, and people don't know much, they're much more divided in terms of distance and stuff. Washington's the one real glue, and he goes to every state. And when he does that, this is actually him coming to New York City, but the drawing makes the point. Before he'd enter into a town, he'd put on his vintage uniform, mount a large white stallion named Prescott, whose hooves were painted and polished before each appearance, and leaving memories. Many people said, I can die now, I've seen Washington. I mean, it's the kind of impact of the man coming and seeing him in person. And his love of uniforms lasts his entire life. After president, not everyone realizes, he became the commander-in-chief in the quasi-war with France under John Adams' presidency. And he needed a new uniform for that. He's a long letter in his records. How does he want the uniform spelled out? It calls for extensive embroidery, for example, and the president writes his tailor and says, find the embroiderer, quote, who's most celebrated and esteemed the best to make it. Sadly, he never got to wear that uniform. He hoped to wear it at the wife of his niece Nellie, but no such luck. Not niece, but step-grandchild. Washington's deft use of wardrobe to communicate power and cement loyalty seems to have worked well. Of course, it was not just the way he looked that men admired him. It was for the character that he possessed and he showed. Americans loved himself for the way he conducted himself, especially after his appointment as commander-in-chief in the Continental Army. When he's appointed in 1775, he is put center stage, and there he will stay for 24 years, absolutely center stage until his death in 1799. Naturally, the American cause needs hero. And where would you look first? To your commander-in-chief. And he filled the bill. John Adams expressed it this way. A gentleman of one of the first fortunes on the continent, leaving his delicious retirement, his family and his friends, sacrificing his ease and hazarding all in the cause of his country. That, no doubt, is how the mature George Washington wished people to see him, and indeed how the vast majority of Americans did see him. I personally think that shortly after he was appointed commander-in-chief, Washington basically comes to believe that Providence had chosen him for an epic role, the role to embody the noblest of Roman attributes, disinterested virtue, and to do so in a just cause which would expand Republican government and human freedom. And for the remainder of his life, he fashions and wears this mask of extraordinary revolutionary virtue. As his friend John Trumbull mentioned, Washington acted under a mask of the deepest reserves and assumed the most impenetrable character I ever knew. It's no easy task. Washington is constantly worried if he could carry it off. Obviously, his elevation offers great possibility, but it also presents great risk, especially for a man. You want to keep this tension in mind to try to understand Washington. He hungers for fame and honor, but at the same time, he fears failure. That's him in a thumbnail sketch, the desire for fame versus the fear of failure, which is so impactful. How people view Washington is absolutely crucial to him. And he carefully cultivates his image and tries hard to act so that he could not be justly criticized. He's extremely sensitive to criticism, I think because he has, and maybe part of this is in connection with his difficult relations with his mother, he has an aching need to be admired by right-minded people. I can't remember where I found it a long time ago. Someone writes him a letter saying, "You owe me money for money that I spent for your nephew's schooling." And Washington writes back, most of us, if we got a letter, say, "What the hell? I don't know nothing about this." It's years ago. Washington says, "I know nothing about it, but if you say it is, I'll pay you." Because he doesn't want anyone to be able to say, "Oh, Washington owed me money and he didn't pay." He was a very sensitive on that issue. Enemy bullets never aroused in him the same fear that he harbored for criticism. It's one of the keys in understanding how sensitive he is. Of course, his ultimate victory in the war silenced his critics. This, you saw the picture. This is the more famous picture. It's not accurate. You've got Martha in the galley. She was not there. This is at Annapolis State House, because that's where the temporary capital was, and you can go and stand on the very spot where Washington stood and gave. This is one of the dramatic moments in American history, because here's a man who was really could be a Napoleon, a Cromwell, or later a Mao or a Castro, in complete power and admiration. And he accepts and returns his commission and goes back to Mount Vernon. You know, the American Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus was before the time of Christ, actually, he lived, where he left his farm to protect Rome against its enemies. Defeating their enemies, he went back to his farm to live. And that's what George Washington does. That's the role he consciously played, and that's the role he believed that Providence had given him. There is an element. Washington loves the theater. He goes every time he gets a chance. He often uses theatrical analogies. The world is a stage. We have roles to play. And it's not amiss to think of Washington on stage as the indispensable man required for the successful birth of the nation. But you got to be careful when you say Washington's acting a role. In Greek, the word for actor means hypocrite. You pretend to be who you're not. I want to make clear, Washington's not a hypocrite. He's not pretending to be one thing while he's somebody else. It is a believed in the role he was playing, the embodiment of revolutionary virtue. And I want to make clear, very clear, that his desire to live under his own vine and fig tree, this is not posturing. This is a key part of Washington's essence. Mount Vernon was his hobby as well as his home, an expression of livelihood and ancestry. He identifies Mount Vernon with autonomy from public responsibilities, a setting where he reigned supreme and felt secure. Now, had Washington simply desired autonomy, being Mount Vernon's master would have sufficed. But he held in his head and in his heart irreconcilable ambitions. As much as he prized freedom, autonomy is freedom from the influence of others. He prized power, which is influence exerted through dominance, and love, influence granted through affiliation even more. There's no doubt that Washington is strongly drawn to the centers of power and action. I kind of think of iron filings and a magnet. It's just, you put the magnet there, he can't help but be drawn. That's why, while he desires to be at Mount Vernon, he often felt compelled to leave it. How many of you have seen the musical Hamilton by any chance? I'm glad a lot of hands are up. It's a wonderful show. In the words of the musical, he wanted to be in the room where it happens, very much so. But he's drawn, I think, even more powerfully by the need for love, not obviously romantic love, but love and admiration of right-minded women everywhere. That's what he cherishes and desires. Now, to be at the center of power and influence, and to win and keep the affection and admiration of his compatriots requires an enormous amount of energy and effort, much of it on things he would rather not do. Something had to give. And ultimately, that was his individual autonomy. He sacrifices that. And the price he paid was heavy indeed. Richard Norton Smith made an interesting analogy. Like Faust, forced to pay the price of his ambitions, George Washington discovered that fame and veneration pursued over a lifetime could only be had at enormous cost. Now, I believe that Washington would agree that the enormous cost of public service was worth the enormous sacrifices he made. He believed, as he wrote Lafayette, the way a leader of a country could immortalize his name was by enhancing the prosperity and happiness of his people. In other words, the success of the American experiment would give Washington the secular immortality he sought. He knew that his reputation rode with the fortune of the country that he had forged. His self-love and love of country coincided. I really think they're inseparable. Now, The last words that a person utters often takes on special meaning if they are the last words before someone dies. And George Washington's last words are, "'Tis well." Examining the actual context in which the words were uttered makes them rather mundane. Why he said that is because Washington was very fearful of being buried alive. And he wanted to be sure that his faithful secretary, Tobias Lear, knew that he was not to be buried for at least 2 days after his death. When Lear finally acknowledged that he understood, Washington responded, "'Tis well." Yet, I think in a broader sense, the declaration is perfectly apt. George Washington could look back over his remarkable life as a whole, and he could conclude, "'Tis well." You know, to his everlasting credit, he had been able to tame whatever demons lurked beneath his conscious awareness, and to live a life of honor uncorrupted by his words, left-handed attempts at popularity by playing to the mob and so on and so forth. The flesh and blood George Washington, flawed and troubled as he might be, was truly a remarkable man, and his sacrifices a gift to mankind and his beloved country. Among the founding fathers of the great unfinished symphony, again quoting from Hamilton, that is America, George Washington holds a place unique and immortal, first and always. He fathered no children, but in a symbolic sense, the United States of America was his offspring. Without him, the great experiment in Republican government never would have had a chance to thrive. On his occasion of his first inauguration, a New York newspaper went on listing all his accomplishments and praises, and then he concluded, "He deserves it all." Yes, he did, and it's 'tis well that he receives it. Thanks for your attention. Now, those of you who have been here before, or usually at Gadsby's Tavern, questions are welcome on the talk or anything you want to bring up. I always say there are no foolish questions. There are lots of questions I can't answer, but there are no foolish questions. And would be happy to take them. And obviously, I make some relatively controversial claims, and if you don't agree with them, that's fine. And if you want to discuss or bring up other points, and those of you who are watching at home, Liz had mentioned that you could put in the chat in if any comes up here. But let's take first the people here, remembering there are no foolish questions. By the way, if anyone, I'm an old retired professor. I have a very thick skin. Get up and go home whenever you want to do so. But feel free to ask questions either on, other things you're interested about Washington that you might want to bring up and didn't have a chance to do it. Yes, ma'am, over there.
One technical question or one technical item before we start.
Yes.
For those folks at home so we can hear. So have the question, and then if you repeat into the podium, that would be awesome, so we can all hear all of it.
Okay, I will try to repeat it, and therefore, with an old man with a hearing aid, everyone speak clearly. And maybe you can even take your mask off for just the question without being fired. Okay. The question is what King George thought of Washington. Basically, when he heard that Washington was going to give up power, he didn't believe it. And he apparently said, if he does that, he'll be the greatest man in the world. King George ruled from 1760 to 1820, all the way through the War of 1812, and he suffers mental illnesses and problems. But I think as many of the people, actually the British came ultimately to admire Washington a great deal in the passage of time. Yes.
You mentioned that he really liked to fail. He had some spectacular feats in the French Indian Wars, and how do you think that molded?
It's a good question. The question is, he didn't like to fail, but he had a number of failures. There's an interesting, David Rubenstein is a brilliant historian and author, and he talks on leadership. And one of the striking features of almost all great leaders is they fail, and they learn through failure. And Washington, I mean, if he had died in the French and Indian War, he would have just been viewed as a glory hunting wild guy, and there's some relatively unattractive traits as he desires to climb. Once he gets there, he's remarkably good, but he wants to get there, and there's drive, and he fails in a number of ways and has disappointments in his life, in not only illness, but not being able to have children, which was something that he very much wanted to do. And just the failures in the war. George Washington's record as a military commander is 3 wins, 9 losses, and a tie. But the last one, he won. So you can forget the others. But I mean, it is a difficult situation. And one of the things that in my discussion of Washington as a leader, when I list 10 traits, one of the most important is that remarkable determination and persistence, where I think it was Robert Morris who said most people would just give up, but he has the stick-to-itiveness to, in the face of very difficult situations, to hang on. Much as he wanted, he wrote, if I could with honor give up and go live in the back country, I'd do it. My job's, it's impossible. I mean, when you read what he goes through in this war, which is 8 years long with all sorts of unbelievable challenges, it just break the heart and break the spine of most people. Is a remarkable ability to stay with it, and of course, ultimately to receive awards and become the hero. There's no one else in America then or ever that will have. I don't mean to say he doesn't have enemies as he goes along and in the war, but the admiration for him at the time. Yes, sir.
Thank you as always. Did he view others as his equal, and when you go out of his way to promote or advance?
It's a good question. Did Washington see others as his equal? Did he go out of his way to advance people? I think one of Washington's greatest abilities is he's a remarkably good judge of character. He can find talented people, very talented people, more talented people than he. I mean, if you talk at Jefferson and Madison and Hamilton, in terms of just sheer mental ability, or John Adams, they are smarter than he is, much better read. Remember, he's a self-taught person. I'm reading Adams. My God, it's impossible. I mean, he writes a letter to his son, John Quincy Adams, and lists about 14 books that he should be reading. And then I say, John Quincy Adams is 10. I mean, I'm not kidding. It's just amazing. But what Washington is able to do is he has enough self-confidence that he will let people smarter than him and help him and use his authority and win their admiration. One of the things that I didn't emphasize in my list, which after reading David Stewart's book I might have added, is Washington has an amazing ability to get people to trust him. And that is a very, very important aspect. But he can spot talent and he'll bring people up, people like Nathaniel Greene, Henry Knox, people that you would not expect to come to the time. Someone like Hamilton, the bastard brat of a Scottish peddler, and utilizing people like that to help him in his cause. Yes, ma'am.
Just say male or female that Washington's closest to.
Who Washington was closest to? I'd say his wife. We can't tell the full story because they destroyed their letters, and I'm convinced Washington wanted to destroy their letters. They're on both sides. It's not just Martha burning them after he dies. I think they did that mainly because Washington doesn't want to be truly known. And he says things to his wife in a way that he wouldn't want us to know. I think they don't have the, Hollywood romance. I'm home, dear. Josephine, Napoleon, don't bathe, come meet me. No. But they have she's a very important factor in his life. One of the tricky things is, though, with Washington, and this is why he's not as likable as someone like John Adams. He feels to be in the position of power he was, you can't be too friendly. You cannot be the kind of guy who slaps him on the shoulder and so on and so forth. There has to be a certain element of reserve and mystery. Lafayette, he's very close to. He's closer more with young people. Eliza Powell, he has tremendous admiration for, and they have a very interesting exchange of letter. But if I were to say one person, I would say his wife. Yes, sir. There were challenges, especially as a new government. When you're used to having no power in government, all of a sudden you have a government that can tax you and can tax your whiskey, which is your main form of currency and income for travel. You don't like that. And Washington faced a full-scale rebellion and had to use military force to put it down on the assumption that if Congress passes laws and they're not obeyed, we won't have a country. But he also, when a few other leaders were arrested, he pardoned them. He didn't want to make martyrs. He simply wanted to achieve, to emphasize that the people have spoken and you have to obey the rules and elect other people who will get rid of the rules. But Washington, he wouldn't fit in too closely today. Washington is, the great Lincoln quote, government of the people, by the people, for the people. Washington is government of the people, for the people, but not so much by the people. He is skeptical. He's not in a Trumpian kind of conservative way, but he's skeptical. I found a letter where he says the goal of government is to make people as happy as their frail and fallible natures will allow them to be. But he does not have, just trust people. People are good at heart. We'll just let them. He's skeptical along that line. Yes, sir. Question is, what about divine intervention? There's no question Washington believes in divine intervention. I just finished a talk on Benedict Arnold and the failing of the plot. And Washington says only divine intervention could have saved us. And several times he does that. I have a chapter in my first book, Realistic Visionary, on Washington and religion. And it's somewhat controversial. A lot of people want to make Washington into an evangelical Christian. He simply isn't. On an accurate assumption, you can go through his entire personal papers, and he never mentions Jesus' name once, or symbols of him like Savior or Lord or things of Redeemer, things like that. But there's no question he believes that providence intervenes in human history. His view on afterlife is murky. He does believe in some kind of afterlife, but he doesn't stress it. And to me, because one of the most comforting things of religion is you'll connect with the loved ones when you're gone. And when he writes letters of condolence, when he does do them, he never, correct me if I'm wrong, but never does he say, give the comfort. They say, find comfort in religion, philosophy, and things like that. But he never says, I know you will be with your loved ones again. It's a vaguer use. There is an afterlife, and he will be part of it. And he's vague, and he doesn't worry about it. He doesn't deny it. He thinks it will be there, but he never talks about it. Again, religion is something Washington wants all of us in the room to like. If I get up and give you my religious views or my political views, all of a sudden you've lost some people. Oh God, you mean he voted for Biden? No, I don't like him. So there's always a tree. He doesn't want to do that. I remember a story when some of the peasants in England asked the Lord, well, what's your religion? We want to know, you're our Lord. teach us what you know. And he didn't want to do it. And they asked me, he said, well, my religion is the religion of wise men. I said, oh, what's the religion of wise men? Wise men never tell. So I think Washington is a wise man, and he's not going to share his religion. So that it's hard for us to know what's deeply embedded, because he will not open up. He once said, in religion, my principles are few and simple, like in politics. And so he doesn't go into it. Yes, ma'am. Who paid for Udone to come over? Thomas Jefferson was the person who knew Udone and got it. What the actual commission was, I might have known it years ago, but I don't know it now. But I do know Jefferson was the driving force in recognizing. And Udone, as I like to think of him as the Michelangelo of the 18th century. I mean, he's just a brilliant sculptor. No one is as brilliant as Michelangelo. And if you stop and think, go look at the statue of David, and there's not one person in the 7 billion people that live in this earth that could do it today, all these years later, that he was able to do. It's a lost art, and he was just a genius. There was a hand over there. Yes. Yeah. The question is basically, Washington might have been a good physical specimen, but there certainly is the exception, and that is his teeth. And that's one of the reasons he doesn't smile so much, I think, is because he doesn't have a particularly attractive group of teeth. His last, he had one tooth when he became president of the United States, which he soon lost, but it went back a long time. And actually, I found a little footnote when they were looking for his mother's grave, and she had lost all her teeth. So it was something perhaps, genetically involved. Yes. Sure. The question is Washington's relation to Brian Fairfax. Brian Fairfax was the younger son of William Fairfax. He was deeply religious. Washington liked him and was close to Fairfax. Some of his last letters, as a matter of fact, the reference to not desiring popularity by left-handed methods was to Brian Fairfax. Brian Fairfax is a nice guy, a wishy-washy kind of guy. He's a loyalist. He wants to join the war. He doesn't do this. He just lacks the kind of strength and fiber of Washington. But he becomes ultimately Lord Fairfax after the death of Thomas Lord Fairfax. Washington thinks highly of him and is close to him. And Brian Fairfax thinks very highly of Washington and writes a wonderful letter, because Brian Fairfax is a loyalist. And Washington goes out of his way to support Brian Fairfax at a time. And Brian Fairfax writes him, he said, it would be so easy, for you to discount me. Now I'm on the other side, but you wrote this letter. I forget the details of it, but Brian Fairfax greatly admired him. And he's an interesting guy, but he just lacks the real strength of character, I think. Well, on a rainy night, I hope you felt it was worth the trouble. I'm glad you came. Thank you very much.
So yes, thank you again all for coming. Hopefully the first of many hybrid lectures here at the Lyceum.